Across the world, every day, men and women of the wrestling world are contemplating just one thing. What is the best wrestling faction of all time?
Well, that's not quite what you're going to be doing today.
Am I not?
Nope. You're going to choose the best #fantasy booking factions that they gave you from last week.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, available on all platforms and YouTube. He's the Apex Podcaster. He's the wise owl of professional wrestling. He smells better than Dude Love with Sex Panther on. He's the king of fantasy booking. He is your favorite podcaster's favorite podcast. He is Omega Luke, and you're listening to the Omega Luke Wrestling Podcast.
I generally don't know where he goes once he tells me what video I'm making.
What is going on, everyone? My name is indeed Omega Luke, and today we are going to be recording the very first fantasy booking fractions of factions, fantasy booking factions of fantasy booking fractions, #fantasy booking factions. That is right. I am bringing this back exclusively to my YouTube channel, as before we sort of dabbled a little bit on the old Twitter and spotlighted my 3 favourites per fantasy booking faction on the podcast. But now that I have a platform on YouTube, I thought it would be much more fun to bring this as an exclusive episode because so many of you enjoyed fantasy booking factions. There are so many of you guys who responded to the very first fantasy booking factions that I have brought back. So this is episode 1. Episode 1. I don't even really know those 3 languages. The first stipulations for episode 1 of #fantasy booking faction right here on Omega Luke Wrestling was indeed as follows. The leader of the faction, the person you had to choose to lead your #fantasy booking faction, was either going to be a member of the AEW roster that isn't Cody, Kenny, the Bucks, or Chris Jericho, or a non-title holder from Progress, a Raw women's wrestler, an NXT member under the age of 30, and finally, someone from NXT UK that isn't the Bruiserweight Pete Dunne. So I indeed did not make this an easy one. I myself have not created a fantasy booking faction because this is dedicated to you guys. I want to spotlight all of you guys, and I had some incredible fantasy booking factions sent through. So I'm going to go through some that I enjoyed and give a top 3. So I will have my third, my second, my first favourite #fantasy booking faction right here today on Omega Luke Wrestling. Okay, so the first fantasy booking faction that I am bringing you is Bectual Chocolate at Do It With Flareon. Becky, who is a big member of the wrestling community. She begins with Jungle Boy as the leader. Obviously, a big name in the future he will be. Sasha Banks from the Raw Women's, Adam Cole from NXT, and Tony fucking Storm from NXT UK. Great faction. Thank you very much for sending that one in. The next #fantasy booking faction that I am going to be bringing you is from my good friend Darren, or as everyone else knows him, Mags, on Twitter at DJ Kirby. He is, of course, one of 2 members of Why We Watch Pod, the other being Mike Aaron, who is normally incredible at #fantasy booking factions. He is the Don of this one, and he didn't actually compete in this week's one, so he's given everyone a chance. That is what I'm thinking. But you need to be checking out Why We Watch podcast. I myself was a member on episode 4, which I'm very proud of that episode that I did with those guys. I absolutely loved going on that podcast, and you will too if you ever get invited on. So I do implore you to go listen and go check out Why We Watch Pod. The leader, he begins with Timothy Thatcher, an absolute badass Timothy Thatcher. Raw women's wrestler of Ember Moon, the NXT member under the age of 30, once again is Mr. Adam Cole. And the NXT UK guy is Liverpool's number 1, Zach Gibson. Another great faction that I am bringing you today is from @Bam in Real Life. Well, she begins with someone who main evented that wrestling show that I indeed seen her at. Jimmy fucking Havoc, someone who I've become very accustomed to recently because I've watched so many of his matches. Ruby Riott as the Raw Women's Wrestling roster. A lot of R's. Deonna Purrazzo. Is that how you say it? Deonna Purrazzo. And James Drake. A great little faction, that one. I really enjoyed that. This next faction comes from the Omega Luke Fantasy Booking Champions. They begin their faction with the leader Christopher Daniels, the Fallen Angel, Dana Brooke, Casey Catanzaro. Of course, we've seen her at the Royal Rumble this year. She really stole the show from the women's Royal Rumble. Everyone was talking about her after. Indeed, she is going out with the one and only Ricochet. And they finished their faction off from the UK NXT roster with Mark Andrews. And they've put that Dana and Casey chase those women's tag team belts. Andrews goes after the cruiserweights and Daniels after the world title. And I can definitely see that happening. That is a great faction. As we get closer to the top 3, one that really stood out to me and just didn't make the cut was Springboard Wrestling Blog at Springboard PW on Twitter. They begin their faction with the leader being MJF of All Elite Wrestling. He is going to be a star in the future. Great talker on the mic. And he's only like 23 years of age. Raw Women's Wrestler Alexa Bliss. Obviously, we all know how good Alexa Bliss can be. NXT star under the age of 30 is Bianca Belair. And the NXT UK is Nina Samuels. 3 incredible women's wrestlers there being led by the one and only MJF. And I really like that. And maybe that format will pop up 1 or 2 more times again at the end of this hashtag Fantasy Booking faction. This next faction comes from Dakota at Kota is Dumb. Your words, not mine. And the leader is the Bastard Pack. Raw Women's Wrestler Ember Moon. NXT Under 30s Kona Reeves. The NXT UK guy is Jordan Devlin. Great little faction there. Very young faction after the leader pack brings them in. So very prospering faction as well. I'd really like to see that one. Mike Baker now brings in this next hashtag Fantasy Booking faction, and you can find him at Baker_show on Twitter. He begins his faction with Hangman Page as the leader, Sarah Logan coming from the Raw women's roster, Fabian Eichner of NXT Under 30. He just creeps in as Under 30. I've done my research. And the UK guy, Joseph Connors, which was a very good choice because Joseph Connors hasn't been highlighted massively NXT UK, but I can see why you've picked him because he does have some potential. He's also part of these 4 would be extremely physical and intense. I would call them the Final Verdict, great faction name, and their tagline, which I really like. We are the judge, jury, and executioners. We are the final verdict, and you are guilty. He's also put the t-shirts would be outstanding, and I think you're right. I would like one of those t-shirts. Speaking of t-shirts, you can find Omega Luke's t-shirts on ProWrestlingTees.com/Omega Luke. Make sure you go and buy yourself a lovely little t-shirt, including the King of Fantasy Booking, the Super Mario Omega Luke 92, and of course, your favourite podcaster's favourite podcast, Omega Luke. Like I said, all those t-shirts can be found at ProWrestlingTees.com/Omega Luke. Punk Rock Gremlin now brings in the next hashtag fantasy booking faction, and he has the leader again as Pac, the Raw Women's Wrestler as Ronda Rousey, and he just put in brackets, just let her be a heel, and I completely agree. NXT member under the age of 30 is Adam Cole, and NXT UK Dave Mastiff. The combined star power of Pac and Cole will hopefully bring a lot of eyes and also build to an eventual power struggle between the two. So this guy is even thinking of how the faction would break up, and I love that. Probably the only reason why this is not in my top 3 is because Dave Masters, I feel, doesn't fit in this. If you had Jordan Devlin, this could potentially have won hashtag fantasy booking faction this time round, because Pac and Adam Cole would be fighting for top spot, like you said, and then Jordan Devlin comes in and steals the show with Ronda Rousey helping. I would like that. I would like that a lot. Jordan Devlin is incredible. And like you said, Ronda Rousey, just let her be a heel. I am so angry, fuming. No, not really. I just want her to be Ronda Rousey from the UFC. I want it to be like Pete Dunne. I want her to come in, not say a word because our mic skills are lacking. I want her to come in, beat people up, make them tap out and fuck off out the arena again. If she had done that from the beginning and just had that horrible face on her all the time, she would be the best fucking thing in wrestling right now. Just like Becky Lynch is. She would come in, destroy, fuck off. It would be class. Don't you argue with me. I am the king of fantasy booking. That would be fucking awesome. Armbar Audio brings us the next faction here, and he begins with Sammy Guevara, who, by the way, when AEW begins, everyone will be talking about Sammy Guevara. He is incredible, and I'm glad Armbar Audio brought them up. Armbar Audio, by the way, at Armbar Audio, won their first fantasy booking match on Omega Luke Wrestling Podcast, so we shall see them very soon. He rounds up the faction with Sasha Banks, Humberto Carrillo, who maybe shouldn't count for this because, yes, he has been on NXT recently, but it does look like he's gone to 205 Live. But I'm going to count him anyway in this faction. And El Ligero of the UK brand. And he's given a great faction name of Sky's Not a Limit. Very good. I like that. All of them high flyers. Sasha Banks, not as much, but she sort of does count. I like that. Chris Pilkington at Pilkintron1. That's right, there is an R after the T if you do wish to contact Chris on Twitter. Is the final fantasy booking faction outside of the top 3 that is going to be spotlighted today. And Chris's faction is as follows. The leader, the Kentucky gentleman Chucky T. The Raw Women's Wrestler of Sarah Logan, the NXT guy, Bianca Belair, and the NXT UK guy, Rhea Ripley. Fucking love Rhea Ripley. It's basically 3 powerhouses protecting Chucky T, and I think that would be quite cool. That's very different. I like it. So we are now in the top 3 fantasy booking factions of episode 1, and coming third this time round, Conrad El Compacto Newton at Conrad_twice. That's 2 underscores after Conrad Newton. And his faction is as follows. Jimmy Havoc of AEW, Ruby Riott of the Raw Women's Wrestling roster. Again, so hard to say. Trevor Lee, who is indeed signed to NXT. We just haven't seen him yet, but he is very good. And Volta rounding out NXT UK. And he's also put the reason why I have put this as third, because that is a very good faction, but the reason why he gets third is all but Walter are considered underappreciated, and I agree. And with Havoc as the leader of Misfits and Volta as his right-hand man, they could take over the world. But that's just my way of thinking. And to tell you the truth, Conrad, that is not just your way of thinking. I completely agree with you. I think that would be a fucking badass faction. Second place, and I must say, second place just missed out on first place. I really struggled to pick between these last 2. So don't take it to heart that you wasn't number 1. Samuel Preston of Wrestling Blogs. wrestling blogs. And you can find Samuel at Big Badder Bruce. I actually met Samuel yesterday from recording this at Reach once again. Reach Wrestling Show. Such a nice bloke. Really nice. His faction, who he's described as a vicious stable who will attack backstage and break ankles to get what they want, being named the Nasty Bastards, no surprise, is led by the one and only Bastard Pack. Is followed by Ruby Riott, once again, that name popping up every time. Fabian Eichner from the NXT brand, and Jordan Devlin, that guy who I said about earlier, leading from NXT UK. That faction is awesome. I really like that. I really like the idea of that pack leading those guys and girls of Ruby Riott into action and just beating people up really nastily. Nasty bastards. I like it. But just beating out Samuel Preston is Sid the Nerdy Mark Sriram. Sid, I really do apologise, but I cannot pronounce your last name. There's an S and an R next to each other, and I just don't know how to pronounce it. I'm really sorry. Please don't think nothing less of me being able to pronounce your name. You did, however, win this hashtag Fantasy Booking Faction today. And you can find Sid at SidS92. And his faction won on the basis, probably, the faction is probably on par with Sam Preston's faction that we just had in second place. However, the name alone is the reason why I'm giving Sid the win here. His faction begins with MJF, like we said, very cocky heel, very good on the mic. It is followed with Alexa Bliss, very much the same as MJF. Kona Reeves in NXT, again you can see what's happening here. And the NXT UK guy is Jordan Devlin. Now, when I think about a hashtag fantasy booking faction, I like to think how all of these guys would interlink together. Why would they be a good fit in a faction? There's no good just chucking 4 random people who meet the stipulation in this together. And I think Sid has hit the nail on the head. Not one of those guys is a misfit in this faction. They are all very similar characters. They all have very similar wants and needs in wrestling. And this faction name is just fucking perfect. His faction name is Arrogance is Bliss. MJF, Kona Reeves, Jordan Devlin, the most arrogant of wrestlers in each of their rosters. Alexa Bliss, also just as arrogant, but can carry those 3 guys as an incredible faction. I really like it. I hope you all do. Congratulations to Sid. As much as I cannot pronounce your last name, you are indeed the winner of the hashtag Fantasy Booking Faction Episode 1. But I'd like to thank everyone who got involved in hashtag Fantasy Booking Faction this time around. I'm very sorry if I could not spotlight your Fantasy Booking Faction this time. But to be fair, I did get about 50 people reply to the faction this time. So maybe in the future you may make the cut, and I hope you do continue to write your factions because it is a very much fun for me to do as it is for you to compete. So thank you everyone, and remember, keep your friends close, but keep Omega Luke closer.